first of all, I want to applaud AHA for coming up with this idea. Norm, I think this is a superb idea, and I really hope that it's the beginning of many. Okay, I'll start off. This talk is primarily for the North Americans because what I'm about to discuss, I think, is second knowledge to Australians. But prior to World War I, I'm only aware of two organizations that made any effort to export their product and have the body built elsewhere from the origin of the country. And Buick relied on Bedford Motors in the UK from 1909 to build bodies for their cars, and Ford assembled their Model Ts from October 11th, also in the UK in Manchester. So prior to World War I, there really was no shall we say, organized bodybuilding organizations. There were a few small outfits in Australia that did so, and the table below gives an indication of what incentives were provided. You can see that the chassis initially by preferred, they're referring to UK primarily, and later on the Commonwealth countries. The chassis was attracted very little duty. The body attracted 30%. From 1908 onwards, we had a sort of sliding scale based on the kind of body that we're talking about, as you can see from there. In this case, there's little difference between preferred and other sources of the import, but the bottom line is this, that's what they hope to achieve. Okay, next slide, please. The event that prompted Australia to enact a law banning imports of bodies was basically to conserve container space because they were concerned that German U-boats would sink these ships. So they wanted to minimize the number of ships that were traveling. Obviously, the prime source of cars at that point in time was North America. So in 1918, they actually amended it and allowed one full body for every two chassis. But that certainly got the process working. The Dodge agent S.A. Cheney immediately contacted Holden. Well, he actually contacted others before him, but Holden and Frost had been building various saddlery type items, and then actually had won the contract to supply much of the hardware for the Boer War in South Africa. So they jumped at the chance to do this, but they went one step further. They recognized that nearly all the distribution of cars was through agents who were independent of each other and normally were state bound. So he tried to convince Cheney to get these people all to combine together, and he'd build bodies on the Dodge chassis, and that's where he got going. The other significant bodybuilders at the time were Duncan and Fraser, Steenbaum, T.J. Richards, Melbourne Motor Works, and Melbourne Motor Body that eventually became Ruskin Motor Bodies, and British Motor Corporation took them over. Ford initially used these various bodybuilders, but in 1925 set about starting their own operations that were not only assembly but also bodybuilding. GM in 1926 established assembly operations, but relied on Holden to supply all their bodies. When Holden ran into difficulties during the Depression, GM effectively bought them out of fear that somebody else might do so and they'd lose their body capacities. What the Australian government said is, fine, GM, you can take over, but you must let the existing clientele that Holden has to continue using their services. So between 1919 and 1939, besides the 9 GM brands, Holden built for 39 other manufacturers. Next slide, please. Hello, next slide. One characteristic that I do want to show you is there's the granddaddy to the Ford Ranchero. This is a 1934 Ford that was the first Ute, and it became a staple and a much loved chassis, or rather body, to Australians. The reason behind it is apparently during those years, a farmer could only get a loan for a truck, but not for a car. So both Ford and Holden got around that little restrictions and gave them the front end of a car and the back end of a truck. Next slide, please. Now, this is a little, I don't know quite how we're going to handle this, but this is a question to everybody. There is something odd about this Australian-built Chev that is it's either a 1934 or 35. It's a standard Chev. And I'll be asking this question later on. So take a quick look at it and see if it means anything to you. All right, next slide. There's something odd about it. Now, this is another model that the Australians took great pride in producing, and it would have been classified as the first hatchback if it wasn't for the fact that the trunk lid opened below the window rather than above the window. But it did allow the seat, the rear seat, to fold forward and the backrest to fold forward as well, creating a utility type vehicle. Okay, next slide, please. I'm now going to flip over to the other part of my talk. I should have actually introduced my talk. It's initially to discuss the origins of Holden's history, or rather Australia's history, but now we move over to the exports, and this is restricted to Holden. So Holden started exporting the FJ to New Zealand, and initially fully built, but from 1957, it was in CKD form, and further exports after 1990 reverted back to SUP, single unit packs. Next slide, please. This shows the Holden ad in South Africa, where it arrived in 1960, and they basically said it's made for a country like ours. That was the slogan. Next slide, please. Now, I believe this to be the very first Holden that did not have a Holden engine. This actually had a Chevy engine, the 194 cubic inch engine, based on South Africa also having to have local content in its vehicles, and they built a plant to build Chevy engines, both the 2.54 that was found in the Chevy 2 and the various six-cylinder models. Next slide, please. The South Africans went further and eventually decided to take a Holden body and convert the front end to look like a Chevy. And so here we have a Holden with a design that was unique to South Africa, also using South African engines, namely Chevrolet engines. Next slide, please. There is the Ute. Now, it's an unusual thing, but this Ute actually had Holden engines in. For some strange reason, GM decided to put their locally made engine in the sedans, but because they could import the commercial vehicles without tariff restrictions, they decided to put the Holden engine into the car, which made it awfully difficult for the small communities. The dealers had to carry both Australian as well as South African parts. Next slide. There is the Chevrolet version of the Holden HQ. And it was a particularly popular car. Next slide, please. These are the upmarket ones. This is the equivalent of the top line Australian model, which they called the Chevrolet DeVille, and it really was very close to Cadillac interior. They later on, from 75, called it the Caprice Classic, which matched the Australian title. Next slide, please. Now, this is the final group that were exported to South Africa from 1998 to 2014, but I believe they came in fully built up. Next slide, please. Now, other early Holden exports, they went to over 20 markets, including 3 CKD operations, in addition to Indonesia, South Africa, and New Zealand. By 1970, they were exporting to 70 regions, mainly throughout the Pacific, but they got as close as to the UK, to Europe, in supplying cars to Greece. But after reaching a peak in 1973 of 41,000 units, it dropped to only 7,000 units by 1974 because of the withdrawal of export incentives by the Australian government, which didn't seem to me to be a smart move. From 1981, exports from Australia focused on Family 2 engines that went to Europe. These were the former Ecotec engine, and later on, from 2003, featured the V6 engine to multiple markets. Next slide, please. Now, the Australians will recognize this car, but it actually had an Opel 1.7 cam and head engine installed in the long-nosed Torano, which, for those that might know, started off as a Vauxhall Viva, but the Australians extended the nose to fit a 6-cylinder engine in, but the Opel engine was only a 4-cylinder engine, so this is somewhat of a hybrid, and of course they called it a Chevrolet. But now the next slide, maybe not many Australians will notice it. Next. You'll notice that the Koreans decided to create a station wagon version of the Torano. And that might surprise a few of you. Next slide, please. Later on, the Australians sent the Daewoo Statesman as the top flight model to South Korea. I believe they were fully built, but I could be wrong. Next slide, please. There's a later version that they called the Veritas between 2008 and 2010. Next slide, please. Here's an unusual vehicle that went to Japan. It actually is a Holden, but it's fitted with a dual rotary engine of 1,200 cc's. It was somewhat gutless, and only 799 were sold. But also, next slide, also heading to Australia was, to Japan, was the Statesman DeVille, which is somewhat similar to what the South Africans were doing. But this had a V8 engine, and you can see over, of course, I've got my mouse, you can't see it. I can't point it out to you, but it's got the typical rearview mirrors mounted on the fenders, or the guards, as the Australians call them. Next slide, please. By far the biggest exports during the VT to VH series was to the Middle East. And they encompassed a large number of models that you can see on the slide there. They also sent from 1998 to 2011 the Commodore as the Chevrolet Omega to Brazil, where it competed against Audi, BMW, and Mercedes-Benz, and very favorably as well. From 1999, the Statesman and Caprice were big sellers in the Middle East as the Chevrolet Caprice. Next slide, please. Here's another version of the Commodore that was called the Lumina. Next slide, please. Now, Malaysia somehow or another decided to do things differently, and they grafted the front end of the upmarket Statesman or Caprice onto the back end of the Commodore, and they then put an Opel engine in it. And first of all, it was a straight six cam and head engine. They then changed it to a V6 when Opel went in that direction. But then the meltdown of the Asian economy occurred, and Holden was stranded with all these cars, and they couldn't sell them in Australia. So because of the strange rules that Australia had, so they shipped them across to New Zealand, where they became the Commodore VS Royal. So I tried to get a photograph of these, but I just couldn't copy it across. Next slide, please. Now, there is what many Americans will say is the first Holden body that came to North America, but I've got rude news for you. In 1960, you could buy a Holden in Hawaii. And if anybody has been across to Hawaii and seen what looks like a shrunken 56 Chevy, that was a Holden. So let's go to the next slide, which shows other North American ones. There is a car that I dearly wish had a longer life, the Pontiac G8, but it was killed by the bankruptcy of GM. Next slide, please. There is the Statesman, the large Holden that they decided they needed to give people who are locked in the back of the car a little bit more room. Not quite sure why, but it was only a police vehicle. Next slide, please. And then finally, the last hurrah was the Chevrolet SS. And if you look and bring a trailer and other places, these cars are selling for very, very high bucks. Okay. How am I doing time-wise, Simon? Next slide.
You've got 12 minutes, mate.
Oh, but we need to have a little bit of time for questions, don't we?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Now, this is the export that went to Australia, and what happens when you let Australians go walkabout, they get up to all sorts of mischief. But when you send an Australian like Kevin Whale to run Vauxhall, he's somewhat constrained in a very small country, and you Aussies get up to all sorts of mischief. And he went to a show after importing one of these cars, and he basically put a sign on and said, I'll import the car, if enough of you ask for it. Well, the Brits certainly told them they wanted the car, and so that's what they got. What should be mentioned is that Lotus had created the Lotus Omega that annoyed the authorities immensely, because it was not only faster than a Corvette, it could outrun anything with four doors on it. So the next version that he gave, next slide, please, was fettled by Holden Special Vehicles, HSV. And this really humiliated the Mercedes-Benz, BMWs, and Audis. Okay, next slide. The Chinese were quite adamant that GM needed to supply them with Buicks because Buicks had a very high rating amongst the Chinese going way back before communism. So the top flight Holdens, the Caprice, ended up in China as the Buick Royam, first from 2005 to 2006, and then from 2007 to 2012 as the Buick Park Avenue. And I strongly believe that it's the enthusiasms that Chinese showed for these Buicks that enhanced the Buicks that we got here in North America. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm at the wind down stage now. The one thing about the Australian government is that they really meddled in the automotive industry, constantly changing tariff categories and creating quite a difficult environment. BMC, that had initially tried desperately to compete with Holden by putting six-cylinder engines into models that the Brits only fitted four-cylinder engines in, they were the first to go, but they went out with a bang. They put the Buick V8 aluminum-bodied aluminum engine into what they called the P76, and they also had their own six-cylinder engine that they put in. And the claim to fame of this vehicle was that it could accommodate a 44-gallon drum. It had a huge trunk. But unfortunately, at that point in time, Leyland was in too much trouble. VW sold its operations to Motor Products Limited, which started off also assembling Nissan vehicles and eventually ended up manufacturing them. But Nissan, as a result of, well, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Okay, the Nissan bought it in 1976. Chrysler produced a model, its last model that was designed in Australia. It didn't go over well at all, and it not only was not a good success in Australia, it also was exported to South Africa, and that also ended Chrysler's participation in South Africa. So in 1981, Mitsubishi, who Chrysler owned at that time, or rather had an interest in, bought the operation out. Now, in 1985, Toyota gained majority ownership of Australian Motor Industries. This had previously been set up under Standard Motor Company, and they also assembled Rambler and Mercedes-Benz. Now, Standard Motor Company became the Standard Vanguard that was actually quite popular in Australia for a while. Nissan, who took over the VW operations, closed in 1992, and the primary reason for this is what I mentioned up top. The most ambitious government plan was called the Button Plan, and it operated from 1989 to 1996, and it encouraged, well, it literally mandated that some of the manufacturers had to merge together. Toyota effectively got together with Holden. Nissan got together with Ford. That didn't go well for Nissan, so they had to shut their door. Chrysler seemed to carry on somewhat on their own. But by 1996, it was painfully obvious that this was not working. And so that shut that operation down. But by the in 2015, the tariff barriers to imports in Australia were largely eliminated. And so the automotive industry was, the local automotive industry was left to fight on its own. And every single country in the world has some sort of a barrier for imports. The North Americans, for instance, we have unique emission standards as well as unique safety standards. And, you know, other countries mandate local content or the presence of factories and all the rest of it. The Australian government, for whatever reason, decided to abandon that. And so Ford closed in 2016. Toyota closed in 2017, and 3 weeks later, so did Holden. And that, folks, is the end of the automotive industry in Australia. And that is a very, very sad event. That, I think, is my last slide. Next. Oh, we get back to my question. Now, can we open this up? Are there any, has anybody put their hand up to identify what's unique about this car?
Jianmin, do we have any questions at all? Anyone with their hands up? That Harriet was from before. Does anyone have any? If you want to put your hand up in the virtual or in the physical space, does anyone have any response to Louis' question about the Chevy Standard? You've stumped him, Louis.
Okay, folks. Chevy was very proud of the fact in 1935 that they'd created the turret top, as they called it, an all-steel roof. Now, they only applied that to the Master, but Holden was already fielding a steel top from its operations in Australia. So that is what is unique. That does not have the normal canvas insert that the standard models had for 34 and 35.
Okay. There we go. There's the quiz answer of the day. Thank you, Louis. Did we have any other questions of anyone? I think in the chat we had Janet asking about CKP as an acronym.
Oh, sorry, I should have said completely knocked down.
Completely knocked down. There we go, Janet.
Well, those are the components that were used by the foreign plants to assemble the vehicle.
Great. Harriet, you had a question. Yep.
It was more a comment, Louis. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yep. It was, I've been doing some research, not on cars, and but on Japan, Australia's relationship to Japan. And you might be, I don't know if you looked at it, but online there's this amazing magazine called International Trading. And looking at that, you can see that Australia was putting Holdens, the special, I think it was, on boats and sending them up to the trade exhibitions right up through the region to Japan. So in 1957, one of the international trade shows in Tokyo, or it might have been Osaka, I can't remember, had a special there. So that ambition to sell through the region is really early, and it started in Japan as soon as we normalized trading relationships with Japan, which was in 1956. A year later, we were trying to flog cars to them. So it's sort of a really interesting history, I think, about the ambition of Holden.
That certainly is interesting. I mean, you know, they also, by the 1960s, you were also exporting to Hong Kong. I think the Tokyo show would have been the venue that many of the Pacific region would have attended. And that likely was the factor that helped many of these exports to all the Pacific region countries, because, you know, Singapore, Philippines, you name it, they were all getting Holdens because it really was the ideal vehicle for their regions as well.
I think in 61 or 62, the trade exhibition in Osaka, I think it was, they had Holden's, but they also had Repco, and they had a whole area devoted to reconditioning and, you know, spare parts and all that sort of thing. So they're really pushing the whole industry into the region. And you're right, I hadn't thought about that they'd used Japan probably in those trade shows for the whole region, because the whole region would have gone to them. So that's interesting.
I think Louis, it was interesting that the name Button came up as well. John Button's well known as probably one of the champions of Australian industry of multiple Labor governments. In fact, funding from him helped build the eco-design industry in Australia as well in the 90s and 2000s. In fact, the research centre that I was first a part of when I came back to academia, where we tried to get academia, industry and government together to do something new, was championed by funding from John Button. However, it's also very interesting to note your timeline there and the very, very quick demise in the final years there of multiple brands shutting up shop when conditions change. I think one thing you didn't mention, there was also a lot of hectoring on the floor of the Parliament that was also going on of various brands, which probably didn't help. So it was, like you said, it's quite sad that it finished up all so quick. We have some questions from the floor. So,
my name is Paul Beveridge from Louis. It's great to see you again. Nice to hear you. I'd just like to add a bit of context to the government activity regarding the close down of the industry. We in the industry were always struggling with our head office, which was, of course, either in Japan or in North America, to ensure we could continue with the volumes we wanted in Australia and the opportunity to export. And without export, our industry was always doomed due to the low volume and high cost gears here in Australia. And I've got the scars to show how both in Detroit and in Nagoya, we worked very hard to compete against other global manufacturing plants for the same product in those countries. One of the difficulties we had was, in fact, that we were building cars that were unique to Australia and didn't necessarily have a global reach. And I know there are other presentations later this morning about the efforts to work with our overseas head offices. But I've got to say, as well as the government, which did throw its hand in and make things a lot more complex than it needed to be, we were always struggling. And to give you a case in point, one of the reasons Nissan Australia closed down is that we were vying with this new Sunderland plant in the UK for manufacturing Pulsar. And ultimately that plant, the capital investment in that plant had been supported by the UK government, whereas the investment necessary for the Nissan plant here in Clayton in Melbourne to continue was based on Nissan investment. Therefore, it was a lot easier to take the UK government's money than it was to put Nissan's hand in its own pocket. So with that situation, we lost out to the UK, and as a result of that, we couldn't achieve the local volume here to justify the continuation of manufacturing in Clayton. So that's just a different perspective, but I know our respective head offices were always looking at Australia with a question mark regarding its long-term viability.
Louis and those online, could you hear all of that from Paul Berenger?
Yes, I could. And
great. So our microphones are working. That's good.
Yeah. The point I'd like to raise, though, is that you Australians were producing the only rear-wheel drive vehicle other than the Cadillac anywhere in the GM orbit, and there was a demand for it amongst enthusiasts, but GM didn't seem to understand that. That's why, when the rear drive went out of the Far East, when America stopped supplying them, You guys jumped in boots and all and filled that market very, very effectively.
Yep. Thank you. And I just acknowledge Paul, longtime member and multiple roles in multiple local operations in the design manufacturing space, brands across Nissan, Toyota, Holden as well.
Started
Holden first. Toyota. Paul Velcott had a question. Paul, if we could be quick because we've got to move on to the next. So was it a point or a question or?
How did Lancia get around importing monocoque lambda bodies, cars with monocoque bodies? They were imported over 600 in the 20s. How did that get around the ban on bodies?
Does anyone know that? How did Lancia get around the ban on bodies in the 20s? Oh, Louis, is that in your next talk, Louis?
Yeah, that's going to be part of my next talk.
Perfect. Well, that's a good segue, Paul. In two talks, we have that. So let's wait for that. If we could give a hand to Louis, and also online, you can do a reaction if you want. I'll show everyone how to do it. There's an applause button there. You can see I've just done an applause has come up. You can do that with your little reactions as well.